Holistic listening for me is this really idea about this concept of listening, right? We think about it in the sense of like we hear a frequency and that frequency creates a reaction inside of us. We hear a sad song and we feel sad. But all of the inputs coming into us and all the inputs that are emerging from within us are all forms of frequency that we can listen to that have information for us. It's just becoming aware of them and detaching from them and asking the questions of what is this here to teach me? That we can start to become more aware of ourselves. In that awareness of ourselves, we can begin to wake up to what's really true for us and what's not.
I'm Casey Main, a jaded, hopelessly romantic, health-conscious party girl searching for meaning. And my mission is simple, to make life better, for myself and for you. I believe real change always comes from within, and the Better You podcast was born to discover hidden parts of ourselves and our stories. A safe place where we have real, honest conversations with people from all walks of life to help better understand ourselves so we can become better versions of ourselves. So come along on this journey of discovery with me so you can become a better you. And welcome back to another episode of the Better You podcast, where we focus on better understanding our relationship with ourselves. I am your host, Casey Main, and as always, I thank you so much for being here and for tuning in week after week. It really means the world to me, and if this is your first time listening, welcome to the show. I hope you enjoy it and stick around with us for a while because I've got a lot of really great guests coming up. I've actually done like a ton of interviews this week, and I'm just so excited about all of them. I almost want to like air them all at once, but I know that would be like podcast overload. So I will keep it at week by week, but I'm very excited about the upcoming lineup. So the episode this week is actually a two-part episode. And the reason for that is the entire conversation just went a little bit long because this guest just has so much cool stuff going on. So in the first part, we really talk about his work as a sound practitioner and then kind of a deeper conversation about just really listening to everything that life is telling us and what we can learn about ourselves from what we experience through our senses, and then kind of how we turn that into stories and feelings and whatnot, and kind of just doing some inquiry into that. So it's a deep one. It's a kind of spiritual one, but it's a great one. And then in part two, we talk about the gene keys. And I had never heard of this before, and it's super interesting and like some pretty mind-blowing stuff. So if you've heard of human design, it's kind of a branch of that, although it's based off a really ancient Chinese tradition, or not tradition, ancient Chinese system called the I Ching. And it's a little bit similar to, I don't know, it's kind of like having your birth chart read, or even like a human design, in that you put in your birthday, the location, time, and date, and then it gives you this profile. But I don't know, there's something just really like beautiful and poetic about this one. So he explains a little bit what the gene keys is, and then he actually reads a little bit of my profile, which is fitting because this is actually my birthday week. So the day this episode airs is Tuesday the 12th, and my birthday is Thursday the 14th. So I thought this was a fitting conversation to air on my birthday week. But you can go online and create your own profile for free at genekeys.com, and then you'll be able to kind of follow along with us. Like the traits will be different, but you'll get a better understanding of how to read it. And then Paul offers one-on-one gene key readings. So I would absolutely recommend, if you want to go deeper into it, to do that with him. Super interesting stuff. And one of the things I'm really loving about doing this is that, I don't know, there seems to be this theme of, in like several episodes, I just have these big aha moments. So if you caught last week's episode, Embracing the Real Rebel Within You with Katie Buman, I had a big aha moment in that one in terms of anger and kind of my relationship with anger. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, definitely do. It's a really good one. And then I have another big aha moment in this episode with Paul, where he really kind of flips the script on like one of my favorite questions, which is, why. I've just been really big on the importance of asking why and figuring out the why. And then he kind of blows that out of the water a little bit, but it's great. It's a great conversation. And I love when I have those big aha moments. And I hope you guys are as well. Okay, so because this is a little bit of a longer episode, let's just go ahead and jump right into it. A little bit more about Paul Kuhn. He is a sound practitioner, teacher, and intuitive guide. His mission is to support others in remembering their innate divinity and discovering their unique purpose in the world. Paul's approach is multidisciplinary, drawing from his ongoing study of sound, yogic and Eastern contemplative traditions, the gene keys, alchemy, and Amazonian shamanic practice. In his work, he applies the tools and practices from these bodies of wisdom to empower clients to transform themselves. When not in personal study, you can find him playing music, offering one-on-one gene keys readings, and leading 7 Senses transformational workshops around the world with his partner, Dr. Erica Matlock. And Erica was also a guest on the show, and her episode is amazing. So definitely go check that out. It is episode 38, Understanding and Addressing Our Holistic Self with Dr. Erica Matlock. Okay, but in today's episode, we discuss what it means to be a sound practitioner and how sound can impact our consciousness, Paul's history with music and how he got into this work, his spiritual awakening and what led to it, what holistic listening entails and what we can learn from it, how life talks to us through our senses, triggering feelings and stories in our internal state, which creates an opportunity for us to be aware of them and question them. How maybe my favorite question, why, is actually a trap and what we should do instead of trying to figure out the why. The difference between Eastern and Western instruments and how sound can impact our brainwaves. His definition of consciousness and how language falls short in describing it. And then finally, in part 2, we discuss the gene key system and he reads some of my gene keys profile. And just to give you guys a little bit of a heads up of what we've got coming next week. So we're kind of continuing on this archetype theme. So the gene keys is an archetypal system. And I think I'm saying that word right. For some reason, I have a big issue with archetypal, whatever system. And then next week, we're talking archetypes again, but this time from more of a psychological perspective. So our guest is Gary Bobroff, and he is a student of Carl Jung, who is one of I think he's considered one of the founders of psychology. So another super interesting conversation about archetypes, but this one is purely from a psychological standpoint and just I don't know. They coincide nicely though. So if you listen to this episode, definitely listen to next week's episode as well, because it's kind of another perspective on just some of these basic frameworks that are found throughout life and throughout all of us and how understanding yours can really help you navigate life. All right, so that is it. We're going to go ahead and jump into part 1. So I definitely want to start with your background and how you got into all the work that you do, because it's all super interesting and not exactly commonly found professions, I guess. So kind of how did this all come to be?
Well, good thing we have a little time because it's actually kind of such a good question. So my work now is I work as a sound practitioner, and I work with a lot of people, both one-on-one and in groups, in order to help teach them how to listen more deeply to themselves, to cultivate listening. And I've been a musician for much of my life, and that's really the seed that led me to being a sound practitioner. And a sound practitioner is really, it's using sound as a therapeutic tool to help people develop deeper awareness, and as a meditative tool to help people learn to concentrate more deeply. And then there's also the healing benefits that come from the sound's ability to help calm the nervous system and bring you into a deeper parasympathetic state. So there are a lot of levels to what it means to be a sound practitioner. But to answer your question, the root of it was really just a fascination my whole life with consciousness and music. And I've been playing music for, wow, almost 30 years now. And I never saw myself doing this. I actually could never really see what I was supposed to do for so long. I spent most of my life trying on hats that didn't really fit. I worked in Hollywood for a period and in marketing, and then I ended up in the corporate finance world. Worked for a company called American Express for a few years, and much of my life was spent in really repressing the desire to follow this path and a belief that it wasn't possible to use music or play music as part of my livelihood. And that belief really kept me, trying on a bunch of hats that didn't fit, because those were the things that, society deemed as what one does. So I had a spiritual awakening at very early, and then I spent a large portion of my adulthood denying that aspect of myself and chasing the external validations of the world. So it really started to wake up in me, I think, around 2013 again. And, for a few years, I let go of the corporate job, and a lot of other things were let go of, which we can potentially maybe get into later. But I started to play music again, and I started to play in front of people. I never ever played music in front of people. I was so terrified to do that. And I started to get a lot of good feedback that people liked my music. And then in 2000, I believe it was 2015 or early 2016, I met a man. His name is Alexandre Tanus, and he's a sound practitioner. And this man knows more about the properties of sound, how they impact the body, how they impact consciousness, and all the weird esoteric stuff that goes along with it. And he might have a different version of how it happened, and from my perspective, I had a sound meditation experience with him, and it really profoundly changed me. And I asked him if I could help him create some events, and he was kind enough to say yes. So that started me on this path of helping him produce a lot of his kind of his large scale meditations that he would do. And for a long period of time, I was helping him do that and learning through observing. My type of learning has always been through observation and then self-application. And that began my understanding of how to work with, the instruments that you somewhat usually, I guess, associate with sound healing. And I don't really use the term sound healing, but sound healing or sound meditation or sound baths. And so learning the gong and its properties, learning how to use bowls and why they work, and a variety of other instruments. And then, starting to just apply it first in my own life and in my own process, and then starting to work with people, starting with friends. And, this entire time continuing that self-study. And that evolved into a lot of work with a lot of people, which kept deepening my attention to detail and my attention to subtlety and my own ability to listen. And the listening to sound and its properties actually tuned me into myself in a really deep way, which really brilliantly and beautifully, I guess, augmented and supported my own awakening process to myself. And during this period of time, I was really going through a large death and rebirth process in my own life. And that's really what woke it up. And then at one point I had this moment where I decided that this was my path. And then I went all in to it. And I had been working a really nice consulting job that paid really well. And I one day just decided, if I don't let this go, I'll never do what the thing I want to do. And I let it go, and I had no plan. And then the plan unfolded itself and led me down a road over the last 4 years that's been really mind-blowing and spectacular and very painful in moments, but that it was all in service of me seeing myself. And then as a result of seeing myself, be able to step into, a path of service. So I hope that answered the question.
It does. And you know that I love that story because as we were talking about before we started recording, I had a similar story of leaving a very good paying job, very secure job to pursue a passion even without a plan. So I'm glad to know I'm not the only one that did that. And I love it that you're now in this really cool, esoteric, spiritual work, yet like you used to work at American Express. Like that's just proof to everybody that it's okay to try on all those different hats. And it's okay if they don't fit to take them off and like kind of keep going until your path does unfold. Are you okay sharing with us a little bit about the spiritual awakening you mentioned that you did have when you were young?
Of course. I mentioned this a little bit on our little pre-talk, but I grew up in Michigan, and I have a really awesome family. They're very loving and caring. And my parents, like many parents in our generation, it didn't work out and they got a divorce. And this is in my early teen years. And it made me very, very angry. I was very angry with both of them for a very long time. And during that time, a part of me shut down, and part of my reactionary teenage angry was to reject a lot of power structures and authority. And I was never considered myself really too much of a fan of organized religion. I had a lot of problems with it as a teenager. And then, adopting the persona of a punk rock kid, really, that just doesn't fit. so I identified for a very long time as either agnostic or an atheist. And it was just like, this is all a bunch of crap. And this is not, none of this is real, et cetera, et cetera. And then fast forward to college. I was at the University of Michigan. And when I got to college, a lot of the fallout of my not dealing with a lot of my emotions and problems that had come up through my parents' divorce in my teenage years kind of caught up to me. And I was very depressed for the first year and a half of college. And as a result of that depression, also had a lot of social anxiety, and got into a really hard place in myself. And my sophomore year of college, I didn't go to a lot of class. I played a lot of music, but I didn't go to a lot of class. And there was only one class that I really wanted to go to. And it was a class that I had signed up for almost on a whim. And it was called Psychology and Spirituality. Mm. And the first day I walked into that class, it was taught by this old time professor. I don't even know if he's still at Michigan, but his name was Richard Mann. And Richard Mann was an old Vietnam War activist. And similar to Ram Dass, he had this in the early 70s, he had this awakening where he went to India and he found a guru. And that's his story. But what was so unique about him, it was his presence. And the first day I walked into class, I have a distinct imprint of my experience as a really strong memory. And he had this presence about him that I had never experienced before in anybody else. He was like really there. And I didn't really even know how to identify what that was, but I felt something when I was around him that I didn't really feel other places. So I became really curious, like, what does this guy know that I don't? Mm-hmm. And the first thing he said to our class is, he comes in all nonchalant and he says, "Welcome everybody, blah, blah, blah. Welcome to the class. This class will not be like any other class you've taken. I will not be assigning you a grade. You will assign yourself the grade you think you deserve at the end of the class." And that first thing, he put the responsibility onto our own shoulders to be in integrity with how we show up and being honest with what we think we deserve based on our effort. So just that moment alone was like, wow, this is crazy. And then the entire course was about studying the nature of consciousness, studying psychedelics. We would go on field trips to Buddhist monasteries and we'd meditate in class. And this is really before I meditated. And it opened up a world and universes of thought that I hadn't had access to. And a big, huge part of that, the study we did had a lot to do with Buddhism. And it's the first book I picked up on Buddhism. It was just like reading. It was like picking up an old book that I had read 1,000 times. I just knew it. It resonated so deeply with me. And so I got really into, when you first find something you really love, how you become slightly fanatical about it. I became slightly fanatical about Buddhism, and I wanted everyone to know how great it was. And I started meditating, and I was, did that whole thing. And simultaneously, I was going to this class a lot, but I was also not going to a lot of my other classes. So I'd made some pretty poor decisions. My parents were awesome and they sent me to college, and I was lucky enough not to have a lot of student debt. But I took it for granted. And I ended up spending, like, my mom gave me a security deposit for my apartment the next year, and I ended up spending it on, like, I think, partying and just being stupid. And my landlord called her, and this was right before my spring semester. My landlord called her and was like, "Hey, I didn't get the money from Paul. Can you just check in with him?" And she's like, "Well, I gave it to him 5 months ago to give to you." Anyways, that led down the path of her calling me furious and me not taking responsibility, because I'd become so great at manipulating my parents and playing them off each other in the divorce proceedings that I'd absolve myself of any responsibility. I would just manipulate situations. And she called me on it so hard. And she's like, "That's not going to work. Pack up your bags. You're coming home. You're not going to college anymore. You're done." And a big wake up moment, and a moment of really having to come into integrity with myself. And I got off the phone, and for like 4 days, I felt really sorry for myself. And, that the world's smallest violin was playing. And the day before I had to go home and I had all my stuff packed up, I decided to go for a walk. And there was this arboretum, this beautiful park near my apartment in Ann Arbor. And I walked to that arboretum, and there was like this beautiful hill with a giant tree and a bench underneath the tree. And I sat down on the bench, and I had this remembrance of the story of how Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree and he found enlightenment, and he faced all of the demons and, that great story. And I decided right there, I had this sudden resolve that I'm not going to get up from this tree until I figure out why I keep making the same mistakes. And I began to I tried my best to meditate, because I was very, very novice. And I sat there and I sat there and I sat there with myself. And at one point, I had this moment where the thunderclouds started, and then it started to rain. And the moment the rain hit my skin, something in me released, and I just let go of years of anger and grief. And it was just like this explosion of all of the stuff that needed to come out. And what followed that was this sense of connection to something so much greater than myself, this sense of love, this deep, deep, deep love that I couldn't remember having ever experienced. It was beyond like the love of a mother to a son. It was so deep and so encompassing, and something in me woke up. Like I touched like that numinous part and that mystery for a moment. And and I went home the next day, like my demeanor completely changed. I went home, and my family commented to me. They're like, "You seem different. You look different. What's going on with you?" And I was different. Something in me had shifted. I had reconnected to that source within me, and that opened the door for this what became essentially an obsession with discovering my true nature. And so from that point until college, I was very deep into all these spiritual teachings, deep into Buddhism. And yeah, that really lit my path. And then I graduated from college, and I I drove my car out to Los Angeles, first San Diego to live with my girlfriend, but to Los Angeles eventually, with almost no money to my name. And I really needed work. And I wanted to be a film director at that point. And I ended up in LA, and I got a job the first week at a talent agency, a company called CAA. And I worked in the mailroom. I did that whole thing. And this moving into adulthood and moving into needing to, take care of myself and all of that, that process like swung me all the way into the material. And I kind of just like put the other part of me, that spiritual part, on the back burner. It was always there, and I would always dip my toes in, but I became so focused on building my life in the material sense that that disappeared. And then, you know, it kept knocking on my door in all these really weird ways, weird synchronicities. And then in early 2013, it woke up with abandon, and that obsession began again. And that led me through a process of which eventually led me into like a complete death of my old life and a rebirth into whatever it is I'm becoming today. And it was a profound and painful process where I hurt myself and a lot of people along the way. But inevitably, it was something that needed to happen. And, you know, it was beautiful and painful. But here I am today. And I'm so grateful for the fact that I'm here and I'm alive and I'm listening to the deeper currents in myself now.
I love that. I got goosebumps when you talked about, how you felt when the rain hit you. And I love those stories of different like spiritual awakenings because they're so different for everybody. And it's just kind of this reminder to never compare our lives to other people's lives or compare our experiences or look or seek out to have the same experience as somebody else. And it's just more like we're all on our own path. So I love that. You just made a comment about kind of listening to the deeper currents of life, and you have this phrase on your website or this description on your website that I just absolutely love. You say, holistic listening is not just hearing in the auditory sense. It is a development of listening to all the sensory languages: sight, touch, smell, taste, auditory, and intuitive. Life is constantly whispering at you, pointing you to your destiny. I got like chills when I read that because I agree with that, but I think it's something, and I've experienced little elements of it, but it's one of those things that I'm not sure everybody fully grasps or understands. And I even struggle to kind of keep that top of mind throughout life. So explain a little bit more about kind of what you mean by holistic listening.
Okay, so where could I begin to describe this? So it's the idea, it really begins with the idea that there is constantly infinite information coming into your field of awareness. And whether it's your thought forms, whether it's emotions, whether it's the triggers from the reflections and the relationships you have, whether it's the triggers of life, what they bring up for you, your desires. I mean, all of these things, these are all signals of aspects of yourself. And the more we can start to pay attention to those signals and begin to discern the patterns in them and begin to ask the question, like, what is this really? Instead of being unconscious and just reacting to them and then living a constant life of reaction, right? It's moving into that place of stillness, that more receptive state where we hear them and we contemplate what is this? Why is this appearing? Like, why do I constantly react in this certain way to the same stimulus? The same person triggers me. The same type of situation triggers me. What is that all about? And it's in that inquiry and that process of cultivating that sense of pausing and going into inquiry that that deeper current inside of us, which is what some spiritual traditions, they call it the higher self, but that higher aspect of ourselves, that witness consciousness, can start to detach from these forces that are driving us unconsciously and keep making us meet the same thing over and over in different form. So holistic listening for me is this really idea about this concept of listening, right? We think about it in the sense of like we hear a frequency, and that frequency creates a reaction inside of us. We hear a sad song and we feel sad. But all of the inputs coming into us and all the inputs that are emerging from within us are all forms of frequency that we can listen to that have information for us. It's just becoming aware of them and detaching from them and asking the questions of what is this here to teach me, that we can start to become more aware of ourselves. And in that awareness of ourselves, we can begin to wake up to what's really true for us and what's not. At least that's the beginning of the process. And to help us get out of our own way and to help us to come into you know, to help us more deeply trust in life. Often we'll have a desire that we don't think is right. And so we'll repress it and we'll ignore it. Or we'll have a part of ourselves that we judge, that we cannot accept and we feel shame for. And we'll want to like fix that or overcome it. Or we'll have a part of something we did in the past that we hold on to, or something that somebody did that we can't forgive, that there's guilt for. And those are the things that I use those three examples because those are, to me, so fundamental. And so like noticing where those things come up in our lives and how they appear helps us to see where our unhealed stuff is. And when we can start to begin to see our unhealed stuff, we can begin to work with those things in new ways, whether they're beliefs, whether they're unprocessed emotions, or whether they're like the annoyance and pain of what we perceive as our partner doing something to us, our romantic partners, or the blame we have for our parents for the mistakes they made. All of those things are pointing to what's unconscious within us that we can't really see. So the act of listening, the act of pausing and hearing those things and becoming curious about them, as opposed to just going into contraction, or even listening to our own contraction and asking what that is, gives us the space in order to create distance from them so we can see them for what they really are. It's really just another way of saying what all of the meditative traditions are saying. It's using the principles of music as a way to understand the meditative process and how it can awaken us.
Okay, so I'm with you on that, and I understand it, and I try and practice that in my life, of especially paying attention to my reactions and what triggers me and my feelings, to, like you said, kind of do the inquiry to be like, okay, where is this coming from? Like, what wound is this exposing that maybe I didn't know was there? All of that stuff. But in terms of the actual, like our actual senses, so like what we see, touch, smell, taste, hear, is there insight in all of that? Like, is life
Absolutely.
talking to us through that, or that's helping to bring us into our body so that we can hear kind of more the inner guidance?
Well, it's ultimately bringing us into ourselves, because my perspective on the external and the internal is that what we can perceive as the external is filtered through our perception. That's part of our unconscious conditioning. So all of that infinite information that's outside of us, or we perceive as outside of us, is filtered through a very small amount of beliefs and unprocessed stuff that we're reacting to. So, for example, like this, you might be walking down the street and you smell something. Maybe it's the smell of a flower on a spring day, and it triggers this old memory of you as a child, a remembrance of a joy you once felt. That's how smell can trigger this, but it's all triggering an inner process. The external world.
That happened to me just the other day. I was in an elevator and I swear I smelled my grandmother.
Totally, right? So, and then it triggers a memory and brings you back into an older place. Or a smell can come up and it can trigger a trauma, right? Or you taste something that brings you back to like your grandmother's. I don't know why grandma's coming up so much, but you bring it back to your grandmother's cooking, right? And it reminds you of your childhood and it makes you appreciate and feel gratitude. Or, from a Buddhist perspective, all of our suffering starts at the level of sensation. So we feel something in our bodies, right? We feel like a discomfort in my lower back. I have like pain in my right lower back sometimes. So I feel a discomfort in my right lower back. And that then goes into this whole story about what that could possibly be. Maybe it's this, maybe it's that, maybe it's I'm holding something. And so the sensation can trigger some sort of mental association that brings me into a story. And so the point is, when I feel a sensation in my body and it triggers the story, can I create enough distance through that pause so I can see the story for what it is and know that maybe that's not actually it. Maybe I'm just feeling discomfort in my back because my back is tired, right? It's not denying. So in Taoism, they call the five senses the five thieves, meaning they're the things that distract us from our deeper nature. And they can very much do that because we can get so caught up on the sensuous desires of the outer world, like the I used to be, I'm still a foodie. I love food, but I used to go to like all of the restaurants and I would always try the new restaurant. And I was obsessed with food and obsessed with eating and flavor because it gave me so much pleasure. But that pleasure was so fleeting, it would end and then I would need more. And so I bring that up because the senses can be a great distraction, but they can also be a great tool for us to become more aware. And it's in that concept of listening to that those inputs and questioning those inputs that can help us along the way of our own self-awakening, our own self-illumination. Because they're
Okay.
what we're drawn to and what brings us into those states is providing information for actually a reflection of an internal state of something that we might not be aware of, that's probably most likely unconscious, that is triggered through those external inputs coming in.
Okay. Okay. I get it. So just taking kind of what we experience through our senses at just like surface level, that's where it can distract us and kind of keep us outward, as opposed to, like you said, kind of creating enough space to see, okay, what is the feeling or what is the story that is coming up with whatever the sensory experience is, and then using that as a tool for like self-reflection and self-awareness and everything.
Exactly, and it's really deeply with the principle that everything is your teacher, right? Everything. So
Mm-hmm.
I'll walk down the street sometimes and I'll smell like fried food. I love fried food. I don't really eat a lot of fried food anymore because I don't feel good when I eat it. But it triggers in me. It doesn't necessarily mean it triggers a story, but smelling fried food triggers a desire that I really want something. I crave something. I crave those French fries. So if I'm unconscious, I will indulge that craving immediately, regardless of the fact that it makes me feel like crap. But if I'm conscious and I pause, I can notice the desire, see it for what it is, and choose to not engage with it. And I can honor the desire, like I crave French fries, but I don't have to necessarily engage with it. When we're unconscious, we're indulging the desires that are triggered through all these external stimuli constantly, and
Mm-hmm.
because they make us feel good, and then the things that repel us, we want to get as far away from as possible. This is the root of Buddhism, right?
Right.
And so those things. So the job of becoming aware, which is really the job of awakening, which is maybe the job of enlightenment. I don't really know what enlightenment is, but is to become aware of those desires. And it doesn't mean deny the desires, because sometimes it's okay to follow them, but it's just become conscious of them so you can make a conscious choice of whether to indulge. So it could look like something triggers a desire that you either engage in consciously or you see for what it is and choose to either say, I will indulge this or not. Or it could be, a signal comes in through a smell or through a sensation that triggers an old memory of something unhealed or something beautiful that you remember that reminds you of the beauty of life. It can be anything. It's just the point of what I say on my website and the point of really what I teach is you to just become aware of all of these things coming into you, so you can begin to become conscious of the parts of you that you're unaware of and reacting to without knowing why you're doing it.
Okay. Okay. I love that. All right. So it can just be maybe like little reminders. So for example, I've been going on late afternoon walks just to get out of the house, get some fresh air. And I'm finding that I'm just really enjoying them. They've become this thing that I like really look forward to at the end of the day. And I was on a walk yesterday, I think, and maybe it was a couple days ago, but whatever. I smelled like from a distance, somebody must have been having a fire. We had a little bit of cooler weather here. And in Florida, if it drops even below 70, people are like, oh, it's winter. And like, so somebody must have had a fire. And so I smelled that kind of remnants of a fire. And it kind of brought me back to childhood and having fires like in the house growing up. And so for me, it was kind of just this nice appreciation of that memory and I guess my childhood. Could it just been that, or is there more inquiry I could have done into that?
It can just be that. I mean, this is the thing. It's not a one size fits all type of thing. Like it's So if it's a great memory, you could choose to go, see, there's a trap here. And the trap is that you mentalize everything too much. You get into story.
Which I totally do.
Right? So it's really just about being aware of the fact that noticing that you're having this memory that has a wonderful association, and that you remember your childhood, and it's great. It feels good. You don't necessarily need to go deeper and always know the why. The why is the trap of the mind. The needing to know why is the mind, the thinking aspect of our minds, right? The dualistic, rational, reductive part of our mind, the scientific part of our mind, the masculine aspect. That aspect is like, that part of your mind is designed to create meaning. It just creates meaning constantly, right? So in the Western world, we are very much biased towards that way of perceiving and engaging with the world. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's awesome that we can objectify and reduce things down into their essential elements. But that question of why, you'll never, ever really truly get an adequate answer, because it's rooted in language, and it's therefore rooted in duality. So if you come up with a reason why this is happening, it might make you feel good, but there's always the seed of doubt built into it that maybe this isn't it. So often in the beginning of the healing process, at least in my own healing process, I wanted so deeply to know the why of everything, of like, why do I behave this way? Why do I do this? And that question is important. But it's also important to be aware of how we are constantly creating meaning, and that meaning is creating our perception of reality. So the stories we live in are our reality. So what meditation and what the spiritual work is actually moving you to do in the deeper way, in meditation, the reason why you're supposed to observe your thoughts and not attach to them, which is incredibly challenging at times, but is because you're kind of deconditioning that part of yourself that needs to constantly create meaning. But you'll notice as let's say you meditate, right? So
yes. Well, short answer, yes.
So you'll go into a meditation. The meditation's simple. It's like, watch your breath, right? And you sit there and you close your eyes, and you're sitting there, and you're like, I'm going to watch my breath. And then the mind attaches to watch your breath, and then an association immediately happens. And then you're thinking about that time you were swimming and you held your breath. And then it's like when you were swimming as a kid, and then 5 minutes later, you realize you've been on this chain of associative thinking, creating meaning. And so the mind naturally is going to do that. So what I'm advocating for with listening is noticing how the mind does that, noticing how the mind's creating meaning, noticing how when you have the association with the smell of fire, it brings you back to your childhood. Just notice it and watch that and appreciate it. You don't necessarily need to like create a much larger story out of it, but if you just notice the story of what that triggers for you and allow that to be what it is, then that's enough. That's part of the process of just becoming aware and conscious. So sometimes creating meaning is necessary, and sometimes understanding why things happen is necessary, but not to be too caught up in having to dig for the why, because the trap of digging for the why is often, if let's say we're searching for the reasons why there's something wrong with us, which is like a classic beginning of the process that people have when they're trying to heal. I mean, mine was crazy. I had psychics and shamans and all these different people trying to help me figure it all out. And the truth is, there was nothing to really figure out. I needed to accept myself. But when I was in that process, I noticed that I was looking for things to heal in myself. And the process of looking for those things to heal was actually the process that was me creating and finding new things in my psyche that needed healing. I would see something, or I would have a thought, and I'd be like, well, that's this. And I need to heal that. And that becomes an addiction. It becomes a trap, because whatever you seek, you'll find with the mind always. And so the listening aspect is being in that receptive quality, which is meditation, and to just notice how the mind is creating meaning, and notice when you feel sad, what that triggers in you, what thoughts that triggers. Noticing when you're angry, what that triggers, or noticing when you're triggered by a person and what that brings up in you, and asking the question, well, what does this mean? And then listening and noticing what the mind says, not trying to figure it out like you would a math problem. Do you see the difference?
Yes, you've just like blown my mind with the why is the trap of our mind, because I have literally been kind of living in this state of that the why is so important and there's all this significance and understanding, and we've got to get to the why to accept ourselves and all that. And now I'm like, I think I've just been in the trap.
Well, and it's only a trap if we're not aware of it. So it's just, like my entire life is going to be about unwinding this trap and noticing myself. Like it doesn't just one day just click and then the mind stops doing what the mind is designed to do. It's an ongoing process. So it's just about the awareness that like often the why doesn't matter. The why feels really good because it gives us a sense of certainty. We feel certain about it. We can explain it to people. We can explain it to ourselves. We know why we're the way we are, but that's really just a new story to create a new persona about who we are. And
right. I was just thinking that ultimately it doesn't matter because we still are the way we are. Like it's the only thing that exists is the present moment. So, the why is in the past. And so you can't affect change from the past.
that's true. And then sometimes in the process of meditation is like unwinding this conditioning, right? So often when you'll be sitting in meditation, you might just like suddenly feel deep sadness and it might release. And that's great. But sitting after your meditation and trying to understand why you felt sad, you'll find a reason. But the question is, are you creating that reason? Or is that reason actually what was the cause? And the question is, does it matter? And I have to remember this in myself all the damn time because I have this tendency, because it's the way my mind works and it's the way I believe all human minds work.
So can sound meditation, you mentioned earlier that it can kind of help us go deeper into our experience. Like, does it get like the deeper into our experience, do those thoughts soften, quiet, go away, dissipate, anything?
Yeah, well, the beautiful thing about sound as a meditative tool, and specifically instruments called non-tempered Eastern instruments. So this is going to be a little bit of music history or instrument history, I should say. But in all major religions, they use sound as a really powerful way in order to create atmosphere, create ethos, which is a state of being, right? A mood. So you'll find in Western traditions, it's a lot of like organs and singing and toning in that way, which creates a mood. But in a lot of Eastern religions or philosophical traditions, I more like to call them, you'll find things like sound bowls or gongs or sitars, and those instruments have a different quality than many Western instruments, and they're called non-tempered. And what that means is like those instruments, you can audibly hear the harmonic spectrum. So when you hear a sound bowl and you hear that like wobbling tone, like the wah, 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 you don't hear that in a piano. The piano has harmonics. It has these tones that are above what's called the fundamental frequency, which is like when you push a key on a piano and you push a C, for example, that white key, you'll hear just the C. But there are a ton of tones, an infinite number, both lower and higher, that are being released. They're just not audible with a lot of Western instruments. In Eastern instruments, the way a lot of these instruments are designed is you can audibly hear these harmonics or overtones. And those overtones have this beautiful ability of, as you listen to them, they create entrainment. They actually entrain your brainwave state. So when you listen to a sound bowl, you'll notice often when you hear someone playing bowls, you'll suddenly feel very relaxed very quickly. And like your breath changes. And the more you listen, your mind becomes quieter and quieter. And what's occurring is those audible harmonics, your mind is they're actually entraining your consciousness state, and they're bringing you into a different brainwave state. They're bringing you out of alpha, often through beta, and then many times into a theta state, which is a deep state of meditation. So they have this tendency to quiet the mind. And the way they quiet is they entrain the brainwave state and they actually change it. So listening to bowls or listening to a gong or listening to sound, a well recorded where you can actually hear these or live, creates this sense of deep, deep relaxation. And eventually it stills the mind in a really deep way. So it can be a really excellent tool, a good raft to get to the other shore of meditation. And then the other effects that when you start to relax so deeply through that entrainment process, your body and your mind comes into resonance. Here's another musical term, resonance. You begin to sympathetically resonate with the frequency of those tones. And that resonating with the vibration has an effect on your nervous system and brings you out of the sympathetic state, which is the fight or flight state, which we're all pretty much in our stressful modern world, always constantly in to some degree. Mm-hmm. That state of stress, right? That low grade stress and anxiety is really, in my understanding, our habitually conditioned sympathetic response that's activating. And when we're in the sympathetic response, our breathing tends to be shallow. We tend to feel anxiety. We tend to feel stress. And as we feel that anxiety, we feel that stress, and we breathe in a shallow way, we're actually sending our signal to our nervous system, which sends a signal to our endocrine system to release the hormones of cortisol and often adrenaline, which then reinforces the feeling of anxiety and tension, which reinforces our breath, which sends signals to our nervous system, which sends signals to our endocrine system, and creates this loop that we're constantly stressed. So that's why in our time, I think about meditation's exploded so much, is that people really need it. And yoga's exploded because it helps re-regulate the nervous system and bring you into that parasympathetic state. So sound has this wonderful ability through just simply the act of listening to it judiciously. And it has the ability to first calm the mind. And in calming the mind feels calm. So it sends a signal to the nervous system that everything is safe. And then the nervous system calms, and you switch, the pendulum swings out of that sympathetic state into the parasympathetic state of the autonomic nervous system, which is rest and relaxation, feed and breathe. It's the things we do when we're relaxed, right? And that's ultimately the state we would hope to be in meditation. And the reason meditation I feel is often so difficult when we first start is because we're so deeply in that conditioned sympathetic state of fight or flight that it's really hard. And the mind races when we're in that state because of the hormones we're releasing. So sound helps to really down-regulate the nervous system, and then the mind relaxes as a result.
That's so interesting. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, just on a basic understanding level of it, that music is sound waves, which then are going to interact with our brain waves and, help calm us down. So I love that. Okay, I have a big question for you.
Okay.
Because you've mentioned consciousness a couple times. How would you define consciousness? Because it's a big word. And, I think sometimes we can hear it and just think, oh, I'm conscious, meaning I'm awake in the very basic term awake versus not asleep. Or, people are familiar with, our subconscious, versus, and so if you had to define consciousness, how would you go about that?
Well, I feel like there are so many levels of the definition. On a psychological level, to be conscious is to be aware, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm aware of what is occurring in front of me. To be unconscious it's those processes and things that we're reacting to that are out of our field of awareness. That's on a psychological level. That's how I understand it. But consciousness to me is, it's really, it can't really be put into words. It's all encompassing. It's everything. It's everything we perceive as the world and the universe, whether it be matter, whether it be air, whether it be gas, whether it be our thoughts, all of it is consciousness. It's like the field to me, consciousness is God. They're one and the same. And God is one. It's oneness. It's everything. So that's such an inadequate answer because it doesn't really answer anything. but consciousness is inherently for me a paradox. In the moment I try to put it into language, I've limited it because I put it into language. I've defined it, and by defining it, I've made it something, one thing, and therefore it can't be all things. So I think Kierkegaard said, when you name me, you negate me. And that's a beautiful statement, because what he means by that, I think what he means by that is that the moment you utter something into language, you trap it as something, and you negate all of the possibilities of what it can be. So it becomes a thing. And consciousness isn't a thing. It's everything. It's all thing. And so it's like, it's whatever that thing is that underlies all of creation, to me, is consciousness.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, I hear you on the trying, once you put it into words. And that actually, that same topic came up with a previous guest I had on who had a near-death experience. And so, he said, he just had a really hard time trying to articulate what his experience, quote unquote, on the other side was like. And he talked about how the minute you try and describe it, you're not doing it justice, because we don't have the words for it.
Yeah. I'm sorry I couldn't give you a better answer, but that's how it feels for me. If I figure it out, I'll let you know. No,
that's the perfect answer, because I think a lot of times people hear the word and are just maybe thinking on the psychological level. So, but I agree with you. There's a much bigger view and definition of it as well, bigger than we can even really describe.
And it's also like, it's the mystery of existence as well. It's like, it cannot be defined. It's a mystery. And, I think that's why I'm so fascinated by like asking the question of what it is and how it relates to my form and what I am, and even the concept of I, what that is.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because if everything is one in a collective consciousness, then there is no I. It's really just we. You can really go down a rabbit hole of thinking.
You can really go down the rabbit hole there. That opens the floodgates right there.
Yes, it does. Okay, so that is it for part 1. In part 2 is our discussion on the gene keys. So before you start that episode, I recommend that you go to genekeys.com and get your Gene Keys profile. So in order to do that, you will need the location of where you were born, what time, and what day. So obviously, I'm sure you know day and location, but the exact time, you definitely need to have that with you. And it's free. You can look it up. And again, the actual traits, like your Gene Keys profile, will be different from mine, but it'll be helpful to kind of follow along and visually see what he's talking about. And it'll help you at least get like a basic understanding of how to begin to read it. All right. So I will see you guys in part 2.